Section 26 of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Proceedings of the International Geographic Conference in Chicago, July 27 to 28, 1893. Memoirs and Addresses. In the Wake of Columbus, by Frederick A. Ober. I have selected as the subject of this paper that of a work recently published by me, entitled In the Wake of Columbus. Certain friends have rather cruelly suggested that it might better be called At the Wake of Columbus, since the subject has been a long time dead, and it is high time he was buried. But, ignoring their evident flippancy, we shall, with your permission, follow a while in the wake of the great navigator, and inquire if there are any remaining evidences of his voyages and of his discoveries in the land he was the means of bringing to the notice of Europe. The fact that several towns and cities claim the honor of his birthplace, and 2 islands possess his last and only remains, should not deter the investigator, since there are places identified with his career that are well authenticated. Leaving the somewhat mythical events of Columbus' youth and early manhood to the historian, we will glance at those places that stand forth most conspicuously, particularly in Spain and the New World. Summoning before us the picture of those times, when occurred the events that shaped the beginnings of American history, I suppose there is not one so well defined as the siege of Granada, when, after years of fighting, the Spaniards had at last reduced the Moors to the last extremity, had cooped them up in the fortress of the Alhambra, and had seated themselves before the city of Granada, determined to drive them from this their last stronghold in Europe. That they succeeded we know, and that it was at the termination of the siege, when Boabdil, the last of the Moors, had surrendered the keys of Granada, that Columbus appeared upon the scene, is a matter of history. It was in April 1491 that the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella, 50,000 strong, entered the Vega of Granada and entrenched themselves upon the site of the present city of Santa Fe, building there a camp that eventually became a city. Here Columbus found them in January 1492, and here he made his last plea for his projected voyages. Disappointed, he left the fortified camp of Santa Fe and departed toward the coast of Spain, all his years of attendance on the court having apparently been passed in vain. Fate or fortune took him to the convent of La Rabida, on the coast, near the important town of Huelva, and here he met and conversed with the prior, who, formerly confessor to Isabella, retained Columbus at the convent until he himself had seen her and obtained her sanction to his return. The result the world knows. The capitulation between Columbus and the sovereigns of Spain was signed April 17, 1492, and the Genoese returned to La Rabida and Palos, where he completed his preparations for the voyage, sailing in August to the discovery of the New World. With all this, of course, everyone is familiar, but with the places most closely identified with the life and career of Columbus, and particularly in the hemisphere he discovered, very few people now living are acquainted. After more than 2 months of sailing, or about October 12, Columbus found himself at the New World's portal, at the gateway to the unknown lands beyond. This island, the Guanahani of the natives, called by the sailor San Salvador, the landfall of the first voyage, has been variously located in different portions of the Bahaman chain. We for a long time accepted the statement of Irving that it was that now known as Cat Island, an opinion in which Humboldt coincided, but later investigators have assigned it to Watling's Island, most of them agreeing on it who have given the matter much attention. Of one thing we are sure, that it was an island in the Bahamas, and about midway the chain, though islands so far apart as Grand Turks and Cat, with 300 miles between them, have been claimed as the landfall. It is unfortunate that the journal of Columbus, which was doubtless written on the voyage and in detail, is lost, since that might have settled all doubts on this as on many other points. But, in view of what has been published, and after a careful sifting of all available evidence, I think we may assume it to have been Watlings. All the evidence and careful descriptions of the island I have given in my recently published book, In the Wake of Columbus, to which I must refer any one for further particulars. Having followed Columbus throughout Spain over 5 years ago, and having been commissioned by the Exposition to investigate the route of the navigator through the West Indies, as well as to search out all existing remains of his settlements and plantations, when in those islands as a special commissioner during the past 2 years, I can claim to have given the matter some attention. Accepting the courses of the first voyage across the Atlantic as worked out by eminent navigators of modern times, we bring Columbus, at least approximately, to an island midway the Bahama chain. He lay to outside the reefs, and landed in his small boats, finding an island, described as nearly as possible in his own words from the Diary of Colon, transcribed from his journal by Las Casas, large and very level, with a large lagoon in the middle, without any mountain, and covered with verdure. The journal also describes the great barrier reef of coral that surrounds the island, and within which the water is as still as a well, as Columbus himself says. Now, the distinctive feature of this island and this description is the great lagoon in the center of the island, a feature possessed by no other in the chain except Crooked Island, which has never been claimed as that of the landfall. Cat Island has no such body of water, and in no respect does it answer the description as given by the Admiral. It should be observed that the only weak link in the chain of evidence in favor of Watlings is the fact that there are no other islands of any size visible from any portion of it as mentioned by Columbus. But this may not be an objection, for he may have seen distant portions of the same island and taken them for different isles and islets. The island itself is about 12 miles long by from 5 to 7 broad, with great salt-water lagoons in the center, egg-shaped, and almost entirely surrounded with dangerous coral reefs. Like all the Bahama Islands, it is composed of limestone, with a very scant covering of soil. In fact, the rocks are almost denuded of vegetal covering, and that little of the poorest and thinnest. Still the natives have their farms, as they call them, from which they gain the scantiest subsistence. At the time of my visit a year ago, they were on the verge of starvation. The particular spot at which it is thought Columbus and his crew landed on that memorable October morning, 1492, is on the northeastern coast of Watlings Island, at the end of a bay now known as Green's Harbor. From the lighthouse, half a mile distant, the whole coast is visible, and the beautiful beach lies before you, a stretch of silver sands some 2 miles long, terminated by promontories of coral and bordered by a low growth of sea grape, dwarf palmetto, and sweet-smelling shrubs, such as the southern coast of Florida yields. Near the southeastern extremity of this beach, where the coral rock of the headland juts out toward the barrier reefs, it is assumed that the famous landing took place, but the spot is as desolate now as at that time, 400 years ago, no sounds breaking the stillness except the murmur of the waves and the cries of seabirds. On the promontory there stands a monument, erected by the correspondent of the Chicago Herald in 1891, who arrived at the conclusion after careful examination, that this was the landing place. Regarding the natives found in possession by Columbus, we can only say that they have long since disappeared. It was during the first century of Spanish occupation that their extermination was brought about through deportation to Haiti to labor in the mines. Columbus describes them well, and also the few articles of domestic use they had in their possession, as well as the flocks of parrots and the animals of the island. Parrots are no longer found here, but are still seen in flocks on Acklin's Island, 100 miles or so away. The only relics of the aborigines I succeeded in finding were the stone implements they used in their agricultural operations, such as celts, locally known as thunderbolts, a few bones, and a skull. All these are shown in the monastery of La Rabida, that most interesting building erected at the Exposition, through the recommendation and efforts of Mr. W. E. Curtis, and which contains also other invaluable relics of the great discoverer, presenting an epitome of American history. The present inhabitants of Watlings are mostly black and colored, some 700 in number, and have no knowledge of the history of the island at all. Their historical lore is limited to the times of the wreckers, and their information respecting Columbus may be summed up in the query of the old negro who took me across from Fortune to Watlings. "Say, boss, who dis old man Columbia you so anxious about? Here I's been sailing these Bahama Islands more'n 40 year, and I's never seen him yet." They declare that the relics of the Indian are, sure enough, thunderbolts, and that they came down from the sky. One old black man solemnly assured me that he himself saw a celt descend, strike a tree and split it, and that he picked it up at the roots of the tree, after the lightning gone past by. The name of thunderbolt is universal, as applied to these objects, throughout the West Indies. In the Spanish island they are known as piedras de raya, and the present descendants of the Caribs call them by that name. But we will not leave Columbus at Watlings. He sailed thence over to Rum Cay, after that to Long Island, which he called Fernandina, and then to the present Fortune and Crooked Islands, the former of which he called Isabella. The island first discovered by Columbus is very little visited and is difficult of access. Having come up toward it from Haiti, and having been dropped from the steamer at Fortune, only 100 miles away, I was 10 days in the latter island before I could get taken across to Watlings. Respecting the delights of travel in the Bahamas during the summer time, with the thermometer away up in the 90s, no means of communication except dirty turtlers, manned and officered by black men, and no shade all day save the shadow of the main boom, I will have nothing to say except that I do not want to repeat the experience. From Isabella or Fortune Island, Columbus sailed southwestward toward a land the natives told him of and which they called Cuba. His first landing there was at or near the present port of Jibara, on the northern coast of Cuba, and thence he sailed eastward, entering the harbor of Baracoa, rounding the cape known as Point Maisi, and discovering another large island to the southward, that of Haiti. He first saw this new island on December 5, arrived at Point St. Nicholas, recently a subject of dispute between Haiti and this government, on the 7th, and coasted until the 24th. It was on that date, after leisurely examining the various beautiful harbors encountered and trafficking with the natives, that the fleet of Columbus first met with disaster. On Christmas Eve the Santa Maria ran on a reef and was wrecked, proving a total loss. The first Christmas in the New World was a sad one for Columbus and his sailors, but their distress was somewhat alleviated by the good offices of the Indian cacique, Guacanagari, whom they were seeking at the time of the wreck. He sent out canoes to assist them, and took them to his village, Guarico, where they were hospitably entertained. Near this place Columbus erected a fort, which he called Navidad, or the Nativity, in commemoration of the day of disaster, and then, leaving here a garrison of 40 men, sailed beyond as far as the Bay of Samana, whence he took his departure for Spain. The places discovered by him after the first landfall are easily identified, as are all the important settlements made during subsequent voyages. Returning to America on his second voyage, Columbus found land at a point farther south than on the first, sighting the mountains of Dominica and landing at Guadalupe. I was at the landing place in Guadalupe a little over a year ago, and saw the bay in which the vessels lay while their crews were exploring the woods, when they made their first acquaintance with the cannibals. The second landfall is a quiet and peaceful country, now the center of the sugar industry of Guadalupe. But the general features of the country are unchanged, and the great waterfall, so grand and impressive, and which was described by Columbus, may still be seen, to use his own expressive language, dropping from the clouds that drift around the brow of the volcano. In Dominica, across the channel, still live the descendants of the veritable Caribs found by Columbus, and who for many years held the Spaniards at a distance. In this island and in that of St. Vincent reside the only Indians remaining in the West Indies, of the estimated millions found here at the coming of the Spaniards. I myself have lived with them, have hunted with them for months, have studied and photographed them, and willingly testify to their many admirable qualities. Now reduced a few hundred in number, yet the Caribs formerly occupied all the islands of the West Indies south of Puerto Rico, and were a constant menace to the more peaceful Indians of the Greater Antilles. Coasting northward, Columbus brought to view all those beautiful islands between Guadalupe and Santo Domingo, and finally arrived off the scene of his wreck and the site of the fort he had erected. It was night, and all was still as death. The Spaniards fired a gun, but there was no response, and in the morning they discovered that the fort had been destroyed and the garrison massacred. Not a man survived, and not a timber or gun has been found since to indicate the site of the ill-fated Navidad. But I secured one relic 2 years ago that without doubt once belonged to the Santa Maria, and which was once within the fort. I visited the coast of Haiti twice, and during my first visit to the island secured evidence of the existence there of an anchor of the caravel, which was in the possession of a black man near Cape Haitien. By a chain of evidence that led back to the time of the wreck and established beyond a doubt the authenticity of the anchor in question, I have shown that this relic is genuine. After a great deal of trouble, and after a contest with the black man aforementioned, I secured this anchor, and it is now in the monastery of La Rabida. This anchor is especially noteworthy as it is the only authenticated relic we possess of the first settlement in the New World, that of Navidad. Of the second attempt at settlement, made immediately after, I secured many minor objects, which are also in La Rabida. It was in December 1493 that the first town was founded, and it was soon after the discovery of the massacre at Navidad. At Isabella, as this settlement was called, there were erected but 4 or 5 structures that were intended to be permanent, and the houses of the rank and file of the army have long since disappeared. Of the few houses that were built of stone, some traces still remain, and when I went to Isabella 2 years ago, I found some hewn stones and tiles, but these were all that remained of the town founded by Columbus 400 years ago. Though I stayed there a week and persistently hunted, I found only the few stones you may now see in the monastery, not even the ghosts of the departed hidalgos, who are said to walk nightly through the forest adjacent, deigned to honor me with their presence. Isabella today is in desolation, completely overgrown with rank vegetation, and with no inhabitants within the region that was settled by the Spaniards. The nearest port is that of Puerto Plata, some 40 miles away, and the only means of communication with the outside world is by small sailing vessels. Although the original settlement of Isabella was soon abandoned, the early settlers made several attempts to erect forts and towns in the interior of Santo Domingo, starting out from the initial town on the coast. They soon after penetrated to Cibao, the famous gold region of the island, and there erected the fortress of Santo Tomas de Yanico, near the headwaters of the Rio del Oro, or the river from which Columbus obtained the first gold in 1492. I myself have explored the region of Columbus Rio del Oro, and have a nugget weighing half an ounce from the river Yanico, and also some flakes of gold, for there is yet much gold in the interior of Santo Domingo, and the region has never been fully exploited. Santo Tomas is indicated at present only by rude earthworks, but the traditions of its early days still survive, and the memory of the audacious exploits of Alonso de Ojeda and the fierce Caonabo still lingers. This fortress was erected in 1494, and immediately after were started the towns of Concepcion de la Vega and Jacagua, about 1495. Both towns were destroyed by an earthquake in 1564, but from the ruins I succeeded in taking away some interesting relics, which are to be seen in the monastery, and in photographing the fort and the ruins of the church. Not far from these ruins is the hill of Santo Cerro, overlooking the glorious plain called by Columbus the Vega Real, or Royal Plain, where his forces had a decisive battle with the Indians in 1495, which reduced them to subjection and sealed their fate forever. From a tree still standing on the cerro, and called the Nispero de Colon, the discoverer watched the first important battle between red and white races, and afterward erected here a cross which was long a venerated relic. The interior of the island of Santo Domingo is little known, and my explorations there were well rewarded, so far as Columbian relics go, and I would recommend it to the adventurous traveler as an interesting field for exploitation. The Spaniards finally drifted away from the northern coast of Haiti, and the city of Santo Domingo was founded on the south in 1496, which yet contains many things that take us back to those first years of conquest. The chapel still stands, though in ruinous condition, from the porch of which Bobadilla proclaimed the downfall of Columbus, and the house built by Don Diego, the son of the admiral, rises above the right bank of Ozama River. There is a castle also, the Homenage, which was built in the year 1509, or during the dominion of Don Diego. Here also are the ruins of the first American university, date 1507 or 1509, the vast convent of the Franciscans, a contemporary structure, and lastly here are some of the remains of Columbus. To be more explicit, I may say that here are to be seen one set of the remains that Columbus left behind him at his departure, the other being claimed by the city of Havana. It is too long a story to narrate. All the evidence on both sides is given in my book, and also in the monastery of La Rabida, reproduced in Jackson Park. Briefly, Columbus died at Valladolid in Spain in 1506. His remains were taken to Santo Domingo about 1540, where they were deposited at the right hand of the high altar in the cathedral, remaining there until 1795, when the Spaniards took up and transported what they thought were the bones of Columbus to Havana. But in 1877, in making some repairs in the cathedral, the workmen found another vault, which contained a casket and bones, also inscriptions showing that those were the real remains and that the Spaniards had made a mistake and had probably taken away the ashes of Don Diego, the sun. But wherever may rest the bones of the great admiral, it is with the island of Santo Domingo that his greatest exploits are associated, and in that island he expressed the wish to be buried. Nearly every island of the Caribbean Sea has an association with the great Colon. In his second voyage he discovered the Caribbees, or Lesser Antilles. On his third he found Trinidad and the peninsula of Paria, as well as the Pearl Islands, sailing thence to Santo Domingo again, whence he was sent home in chains, in the year 1500. On his last and most disastrous voyage, 1502, and the 2 years succeeding, he coasted the eastern shores of Yucatan and Central America, the voyage ending at Jamaica, where all of his vessels were wrecked and where he remained a 12-month a prisoner on his stranded ships, fighting the Indians and engaged in conflicts with his own mutinous men. The scene of his last shipwreck is well authenticated, and, as the conclusion of my labors in the search for Columbian footprints, I visited and photographed the little bay in which for a whole year he remained at the mercy of the sea and the savages. It is on the northern coast of Jamaica, in the parish of St. Anne's, the most beautiful portion of that beautiful island. A mile distant from the Bay of St. Anne's is a little sea nook, called today Don Christopher's Cove, and on its narrow stretch of beach, with bordering fringe of sea grape and cocoa plum, Columbus stranded his vessels, building over their decks a shelter of palm thatch, and here lived for a year, as Irving says, castled in the sea. Halfway between Jamaica and Haiti is an island known as Navassa, at which the canoe sent by Columbus to Haiti for assistance touched on its way, the starving crew finding there a little raw fish and some water, which enabled them to complete their most perilous voyage. But perhaps I have followed too long after the ships of Columbus. I might mention many other spots he visited, and which I have seen, but with your assent I will bring this description to a close. End of section 26.